Thank you very much, David, and thank you and your colleagues for the invitation to come back here today. And that's what I guess there are words that not everybody uses when they come here, when they say come back. And it's a little bit nostalgic for me because it's almost 10 years to the day since I last stood in a lecture hall in UCD and delivered my last lecture. It was sometime around November 2006. Delighted to be here and to talk to you today about a foresight exercise that we conducted in the last year, and while it was Teagasc that initiated it, like there was huge involvement of others, as I'll explain as we go along in terms of that. So just in terms of the presentation, I'm going to give a little bit on the context, and I'm sure you're all familiar with this, so I'm going to move on fastly through it. A little bit then on, given that context, what are the transformations that are needed in the agri-food sector. And then the meat of the foresight is the technologies that we have identified as being important for the future. And finally, just a slide or two around, well, where do we go next now that we've completed the foresight. So anyway, these are some of the mega trends, some of the drivers of change. And as I said, I'd be amazed if you're not all familiar with these: food and nutrition security, climate change, and so on. Just a few slides on those. You're all, I'm sure, familiar with the population projections. We're at somewhere around 7 billion, or gone beyond 7 billion now, heading steadily towards 8 billion, which we're it's a racing certainty we will reach by 2025 or so. It's actually interesting to look at how quickly the billions are adding up. When we got to 1 billion in 1804, after however many millennia humans had been on the earth, it took us that length to get to the first billion. And it took us another 125 years or so to get to the 2nd billion. And it took us, 30 odd years to get to the 3rd billion, and so on. But they started coming very rapidly over the last couple of decades. And they are slowing down a little bit now. And people reckon the population will peak at about 10 billion, somewhere between 2050 and 2080. Another feature of that, though, that's also very important is the phenomenon of urbanization. And we passed the point on planet Earth of having more than half the citizens of the world living in cities a number of years ago. So, and that's important, obviously, because it means those people are not involved in their food production. It's also important in terms of where future growth is going to come, and nearly all the extra couple of billion we're going to add on to the world's population are going to be housed in urban areas. And if you look at what that actually means for the areas that are growing rapidly, and Asia and Africa are two of the continents where we're seeing most of this growth in population, we're going to and as I said, they're nearly all going to be in urban areas. So we're going to have the equivalent of 1,000 new cities with populations of 500,000 in Africa within the next 30 to 40 years. Or in Asia, 500 new cities with a population of 1 million or more. So, 500 Dublins created in Asia in terms of the extra urban populations that we're going to have. And obviously, apart from the food demand, the pressure that puts on resources and on traffic and all that sort of thing is incredible. So the growing population is a huge issue. Alongside with that, obviously, we don't have any more land for food production in the world. We do have more land we could use, but it would require deforestation, and that's not something we want to do for many, many reasons. So if you look at the amount of area that's used for agricultural production in the world, it actually increased, in the second half of the last century, not by much, by about 10 or 15%, but has stabilized and started to actually decline a little bit now. And if you look within that, and don't worry too much about the graphs at the bottom, but really the four along the bottom are the developed world, Western Europe, Eastern Europe, North America, and Oceania. And you can see land area there for agriculture declining it's slowly now. The scales on the graph might make you think it's declining rapidly. And the upper four, then land area has increased slightly over the last number of years, and they're Asia, Africa, Latin America. And basically that's deforestation to create more land for agricultural production to make up for some of the land that we have taken out of agricultural production in the developed regions. So the story here is, look, we're going to need more food. We're not going to get it by having more land unless we compromise the forests of the world. Alongside that, then, we have the issues in terms of climate change. I'm not going to go into that in any great detail, but two big issues for agriculture. One is emissions, and this is just for animal agriculture, which for us here in Ireland is our main agricultural activity. And you can see that globally, animals used in agriculture are responsible for somewhere around 8 to 10% of global emissions. If you count it one way, if you count it another way, that goes up to about 17 or 18% of global emissions. So agriculture is a big contributor to greenhouse gas emissions, and there's a spotlight in agriculture, to actually reduce that emissions from its activities. And alongside the emission side for agriculture, there's also the adaptation side. And while in Ireland we think adaptation won't be that big a challenge, or at least not as big a challenge for agriculture as in other regions of the world, such as the Mediterranean or parts of Africa, we will probably have our own adaptation issues. And it's only 3 years since we had a very significant fodder crisis here in Ireland, where we were running out of fodder to feed the livestock of the country. So now, whether that was just a once-off weather event, or whether we can ascribe it to climate change, that's a debate we probably won't be able to finally settle for about 50 years. But anyway, we're supposed to be going to see more of these extreme weather events as a result of climate change, and that's the type of thing that we in Ireland are going to have to adapt to. Or we had the floods last year as another adaptation type challenge, if we're going to call that a climate phenomenon. So climate change is another big thing, as well as the food security issue. And we obviously have issues around how we live our lives, and in particular in Western regions, developed countries, we have all the issues around our diet and our health, and the relationship between those that are to the foremost of people's minds in those countries. So what does that all mean for agriculture? All this extra food that's going to be needed for these extra couple of billion people, the fact we don't have any extra land to bring into production and may actually be losing land in parts of the world due to climate change. It means that, to meet those challenges, our food system is going to need to change more radically in the coming decades than ever before, including during the agricultural or the industrial and the green revolutions. That's a quote from UK Farming and Food Foresight, which was led by their chief scientist, John Beddington, a number of years ago. And I think it's a good quote, and it makes you think, just think back to agriculture before the Industrial Revolution. We didn't have tractors, we didn't have fertilizers, we didn't have pesticides, we didn't have vaccines, we didn't have antibiotics. So think of agriculture in that era, and the change from then to now. And think we're going to have to make an equal type of a step change in terms of how agriculture does its business over the next 30 years, if we're going to meet these challenges of meeting food security and helping the earth deal with climate change. So a big task ahead for agriculture. Sustainable intensification, which I'm sure is a word you're very familiar with, that's often proposed as, well, this is what we have to do. We have to intensify production, and we have to do it in a sustainable manner. It's very easy to say it, it's actually very hard to do it in terms of meeting the scale of the challenge that's ahead. In Ireland here, we have our own plan around sustainable intensification, as to how we will increase production in our agricultural industries and do it in a sustainable manner. And sustainability and growth in food production are dealt with very seriously, I guess, in that plan. So anyway, moving on, that's the context. I suppose the next step of the context is, well, where is the role for science and technology and all that? And again, don't just rely on me. I want to quote somebody else. So this is a quote from John Holdren, who's one of Barack Obama's science and technology advisors. He doesn't just have one, by the way, he has a number of them. But anyway, this was one that I thought was nice. And he claimed or asserted, and I'm sure he had good evidence for it, that most of the growth, between 50 and 85% of the growth in the US economy over the last half century, and 2/3 of their productivity gains, was due to science and technology advances. Now that's across all sectors, but I've no doubt that applies to agriculture as much as to any other sector. So science and technology is going to be critical in terms of how our agriculture and food industries develop in trying to meet the challenges and the opportunities that lie ahead for them. So that brought us then to thinking, well, if science and technology is going to be so critical, let's think what are going to be the critical aspects of that for agriculture and food for the next 10, 20, 30 years or so. And that stimulated us to initiate this Foresight project. And Foresight, as the word implies, means trying to look ahead, trying to anticipate what might happen or what might the eventualities be. So we were anxious to look, or to try to identify, or at least get some, I suppose, consensus around what would be the key technologies that have the potential for the next 20 or 30 years to deliver or to contribute to these challenges for our agriculture and food system, and to help us, I suppose, garner the opportunities that are there, because a challenge always brings an opportunity for somebody else. So that's what we set out to do, to take stock really of where we were at in relation to technological advances in agriculture and food. And the process went on for about 6 months or so, and it was really organised around 5 workshops and a conference. And as I said, this was not an inward-looking thing. We had about 200 people involved in this in various ways, or participating in workshops or whatever. And I would say about 3/4 of those were outside, were non-Teagasc people. Quite a few of them people in this room and in the wider community in this institution, other universities in Ireland and international contributors as well. So we had, I'm not going to go through the process in any detail, but we had, a writing team, and we had, they worked off these 5 workshops then that we carried out throughout the process, and tried to distill all the ideas and the expertise, I suppose, that was available to us down into a report that we presented at a conference last March. And that's what I'm going to now go on and kind of tell you, reveal 5 technologies that we thought are going to be transformative for our agriculture and food industries for the future. And I suppose, the first thing to say is, none of these should come as a surprise to you. We're not thinking that there's something coming, in the next 5 years that we haven't heard about now. So really, these are technologies that are on the march and that are going to continue really on that march and make a very significant contribution over the coming decades. So I'm going to have a couple of slides on each of those and finish them with a few conclusion slides. The way they're presented is as if they're separate technologies, but they're not. They're obviously hugely interlinked, and that's just part and parcel of the way science and technology works, that we are really, I suppose, bringing together disciplines if we want to try to make progress now on key issues. So the first suite of technologies we call plant and animal genomics and related technologies. So it's a bit of a cover-all. And this has been a very active area of research for the last 20 years or so, and we feel it's going to be equally important for the next 20 years. And the game changer here has really been the advent of low-cost genotyping and sequencing. The figures for, I think, the first human sequence, sure, David, you could tell me it cost, I don't know, in the billions anyway, depending on what estimate you take. And now we can do sequencing for, maybe €100 or even less if you're depending on the coverage you want. So that's, I suppose, the most tangible output of that today in the agriculture area is genomic selection, and that's where we're using genetic information to supplement the traditional breeding by phenotyping approaches that we had in the past. And here in Ireland, it's 7 years ago now, genomic selection was introduced, and it's an example of one very successful application. That's a chart showing the rate of change in our economic breeding index for dairy cows. So, if that's moving up, it means the genetic merit of the herd is moving up, and you can see that the trajectory increased when we introduced genomic selection, and that's just a hypothetical increase there. But the actual figures are that the increase in the rate of gain since the advent of genomic selection is about 46%. And it's a very widely adopted technology. About 60% of the bulls used in breeding our dairy cows are selected on the basis of their genomic information. So very widely used technology and having a big impact on our dairy industry. In terms of future applications of, in this area, we're going to have beef genomic selection. I think already ICBF have released their latest release of bull proofs were based on genomic information. Sheep will possibly be available in 2017, and the focus now of people working in this area is about incorporating new traits, difficult to measure traits that are difficult to measure on a large scale with conventional phenotyping. But that doesn't mean that phenotyping can be ignored, because you obviously still need phenotyping. So there'll be a link with this phenotyping on a large scale to one of the later technologies that we talk about, the digital technologies. So it's actually very interesting when you look at what's happening in this country around genomic selection. In the dairy, for the introduction of dairy genomic selection, Ireland genotyped 1,000 bulls. and we genotyped those at a coverage of 56,000 SNPs. That was the SNP chip that was used at the time. We're currently involved in Ireland in a major programme funded by the Department of Agriculture called the Beef Data and Genomics Scheme. And in that, farmers are sending samples of their DNA off to be genotyped, and we're going to genotype 1 million cattle in that programme. And it's a small SNP chip. I don't know, it's 10 or 12,000 SNPs that are on it, but it's going to be imputed up to 50 million SNPs. So the data files that will exist after this will be 1 million cattle at 50 million SNPs each. And you can see we're kind of into big data type things there. We thought we had big data with 1,000 bulls at 56K SNPs, but it's a great illustration really of the growth in data. So that's the whole breeding is, you know, progressing along at a very smart pace. But I think we're also going to see applications in management of animals as well as breeding utilisation. So the fact we will have individual animal genotypes and the fact that they're available at relatively low cost will mean we can have individualised animal management. So that could, the most obvious thing in that is the selection of animals, not just any bull with the cows, but a particular bull for this particular cow based on their genotype. So, you know, I'm sure some of you are familiar with that company 23andMe. They're a Californian company that will do your genotype. You send them off a sample of your DNA and they'll give you your genotype for about $100. So now they've run into some problems in the last year or so with making that information available for medical advice. But that was the idea of it, that you would go along to your GP with your genotype and help identify, well, this treatment might or might not work for you, or you're at risk of this or that or the other or whatever. So that's, I suppose, we'll see the same thing happening in animals as well. As the cost of genotyping continues to decrease, that we will be looking for this individualised animal management. The next game changer in this area, like apart from the ongoing, I suppose, developments in the genomic area, are probably going to be the new gene editing techniques that have been around for a number of years now, that give us the ability to precisely tweak the existing DNA in a way resembling natural mutation. So, you know, there's obviously huge ethical debates will go on around these techniques. The scientists or the proponents would say we're not introducing any new DNA. We're only doing, you know, what happens normally by mutation in a DNA. But, you know, whether the populace at large buys that remains to be seen. But anyway, the ability of these, or the usefulness of these, will be again to speed up breeding and to allow us to breed for novel traits again that are difficult maybe to breed, or at least we can speed up that breeding process. So there have already been reports of producing cell lines of hornless dairy cattle using this technology. So wholeness, or animals having horns, is I think controlled by a single gene, so it's very amenable to editing using these techniques. So, you know, that's a report from earlier this year, and there are anecdotal reports that our pig breeding companies and poultry breeding companies are active in the use of these technologies to improve their breeding lines. So in terms of crops, again, genomic selection maybe has lagged behind the animals a little bit, but we're on the point of introducing genomic selection into our grass breeding program and collaborating with Denmark and New Zealand in relation to that. And again, I think there's huge opportunities with the gene editing techniques to work in that area. So the second and related technology area is the microbiota, which, for those of you not familiar with it, is the totality of microorganisms in a particular organism, or in a particular place, or in a particular environment. So we have things like the human microbiota, or the human gut microbiota, or the soil microbiota, or the animal gut microbiota, and so on. So it's the community of organisms that would live in a particular place. And again, the game changer here that has opened up this to us is the advent of low-cost DNA sequencing. And that allows us now to study whole microbial communities, whereas with traditional culturing methods, what microbiologists would have used over many, many decades in terms of their research culturing, they were probably only able to culture maybe somewhere between 1% and 5% of the organisms in any particular environment. So that hugely limited their ability to study the community of organisms and the interactions between them in any environment. So now with low-cost DNA sequencing, they can just sequence everything and know what's going on, or know what's all the organisms that are present in any particular environment. So where is the science in this? And Ireland actually is very well positioned internationally in relation to this area. There's rapidly expanding evidence that the human microbiota, or the human gut microbiota, has a very big influence on the physical health of people and also on their mental health and development. And there's also a large body of evidence accumulating now that human gut microbiota is influenced by your diet, by what foods you eat and how you eat them. And therein obviously lies a huge opportunity for our food industry. And this is just one example of some of that evidence. It's a study that was done with the Irish rugby team. And the purpose of the study was to, look at the type of diet and exercise regime that a cohort of people like that might have, obviously a very extreme group of elite athletes. And they were compared to a cohort of people in the general population who would be way fitter certainly than me, and probably a lot fitter than some of you, but I'm sure we've some equally fit people here. So anyway, they were a fairly fit group of ordinary people, we'll describe them. And without going into the details, or going into all the minutiae of it, basically the conclusion was that athletes like the Irish rugby team, they had a greater diversity of microbes in their gut, and that's seen as being very desirable. The more diverse your population of microbes, the better. And that was correlated with a higher protein intake in those people. So, that's the type of evidence that diet influences your gut microbiota, and therefore you can influence your health, and not just your physical health and well-being, but also how you feel. So that's, as I said, a great opportunity for our food industry. And equally exciting, I think, for the rest of agriculture is the potential to apply those techniques to the study of animal nutrition or animal digestion, to study of soil microbiology, plant microbiota, and so on. Like for someone that dabbled in animal nutrition myself 20 and 25 years ago, the microbes in the rumen were just this big black box that you kind of never went near, because you knew of scientists that had spent their whole career culturing rumen microorganisms and came out the other end not much wiser for it. Now maybe the same will happen with our genotyping of those, but at least we have the ability now to get a much better picture of what's in there and their numbers and so on. So we would see that this concept of the microbiota and the study of the microbiota as being applicable across a wide range of environments, and likely to give us a lot of insights into what's happening in terms of agricultural production. In terms of the future, I think next generation sequencing, which is the technology underlying this, will continue to evolve and get cheaper and get better and so on. The limiting factor is going to be bioinformatics, the huge data sets that are being generated. So the people that can handle those data sets are the people in demand now, and they're the ones that hold the keys to the kingdom. However long that will last, it's hard to know, because something else will come along that will probably replace the human in the bioinformatics end of things. So make hay while the sun shines, any of you that are in the bioinformatics field. So over the next 15 to 20 years, we are going to see, we already see quite a few of them, but we're going to see a lot more foods being developed to promote health. Hopefully we will see enhanced agricultural efficiency as a result of studying this. Hopefully reduced emissions, because of the relationship between digestion and methane emissions in ruminants, and enhanced soil quality, and so on. The third area, and in one ways this is the most diverse, is what we call digital technologies. And there's no single game changer here that we could identify. It's just really the ongoing march of technology. And you think back to technology 10 years ago, 20 years ago, and look at where it is now. Technology just keeps developing. So in the area of ICT and sensors or robotics or data analytics and so on, we're continually seeing technology getting better and getting cheaper and becoming more widely applicable, and more uses being invented, or more things that can be measured and with that technology. So we've lots of things that are available to us now as we speak. We have things like a yield map of a field, and that can be measured either using remote sensing via a satellite or a drone or a sensor that's on a combine. And you can measure the variation in yield and draw a lovely map like that. And of course the goal is then you measure the variation, you hopefully find the cause, you correct the problem, and you can make all the field yield to the potential of the highest part of the field. But often it doesn't work out quite as simply as that. But anyway, that type of measurement technology is widely available now. Less used, I guess, is the use of sensors mounted on machinery that vary crop inputs as according to that type of a map. So this is one. It's actually I can't think of the name of one. The fertilizer companies have developed this. The one from Norway, maybe someone can think of them. Yara. This is a sensor that Yara have been involved in developing, and basically it's measuring the greenness of the crop, and using an algorithm it's saying how much fertilizer you need to apply as you're, and varying that according to the greenness of the crop, and the fertilizer applicator then puts on a variable amount of fertilizer to suit the crop's yield, to suit the crop's demand. The big challenge in that, of course, is making sure your algorithm works right. But anyway, those type of sensors are available. Again, in terms of weed detection, this is a big area of research. But basically detecting weeds and either via drone and mapping the field as to where the weeds are, and then sending in a herbicide applicator that can spot spray, or again having a machine mounted sensor and just spraying where there are weeds rather than spraying the whole field. So that type of variable rate application. We have automated milking systems. I think the figure for Europe now is that of all the new milking machines installed in 2015, 60% of them were robots. You think back 10 years ago, a robotic milking machine was something if you were interested, you'd take a drive to go and see it. Not everybody, of course, would be interested, but it was a novelty. Here in Ireland, we're much lower than 60%, but it's growing in terms of the use of robotic milkers. The reason being in Ireland is not that we're technology laggards, but they don't work as well in grazing systems as they do in a continuously housed system. So that's conventional technology now rather than new technology. We have the emergence over the last number of years of a whole suite of different sensors that we can use, just as we had with the crops measuring the greenness. You can measure everything and anything on an animal. You can put things inside in the animal's stomach. You can put pedometers on the animal's foot. You can put things on its collar to measure its movement and its grazing and so on. And we have, as well as sort of physical sensors like that, we have biosensors being developed that allow you to do, anyone that you'd be familiar with insulin that, takes a little pinprick of blood and checks their blood sugar. Again, there are several sensors now that you can do that with animals, and you can detect the presence of a disease. So huge developments there in relation to sensors. In terms of satellites and remote sensing, again, huge progress there in terms of our ability to measure or monitor things. And the EU recently released, or whatever you say you do with a satellite, you pull it up and leave it off or whatever. They released a new satellite, the Sentinel-2 satellite, in the last 12 months or so, and that has improved the spatial resolution from hundreds of meters down to tens of meters. And that data is available free of charge to the research community, guaranteed for the next 20 years. So you can see the possible applications of being able to measure things. And cloud cover is not an issue with some of the cameras on these sensors. So again, for anyone into remote sensing, there's huge opportunities there to measure things. One of the things that we are interested in here in Ireland is obviously measuring pastures, because we're unique apart from a few countries in terms of having so much of our agricultural area covered in pasture. So that's a big area of interest for us, and we have been looking at using remote satellites or remote sensing from satellites, and we can measure down to a kind of a parish level the amount of grass on our fields. So with that new satellite, we expect to get that down certainly to a big field level before too long. Obviously, that's not good enough for day-to-day measurement for a farmer. So there have been lots of developments, well, not lots, but there's a few gadgets on the market now to replace this traditional instrument up there called the plate meter, which is it's a manual instrument. You go out and walk the field with it and measure your pastures. So there's a thing that we've been involved in Teagasc in developing called the grasshopper, which is basically an automated version of that sends the data straight to your smartphone. There are other ones, another one called the grasshopper, the grasshopper that's I think on the point of being launched. And basically they're trying to take the drudgery out of grass measurement, but also very importantly, it puts the data straight into a database. It's not on a pad. that probably never gets transferred onto a computer, and if it ever gets transferred onto a computer, it never gets loaded into a database. So with this, I think it's not for me, the big advance here is not actually taking the drudgery out of it, it's that the data is automatically captured into a database. So now we have this database here in Ireland called Pastures Ireland that is collecting all the measurements from about, I don't know, is it 3,000 farmers or something like that now at this stage, that they would make their weekly measurements of grass covers on their farm. So it's something unique that we have here in Ireland. And we'll probably see drones eventually doing our grass measurement, replacing plate meters and grasshoppers. And so anyway, that's of particular interest to us here in Ireland. Just in terms of all this area of digital technologies, it's easy to become phased and, to become starry-eyed with the latest sensor or the latest gadget, or, and if you were, any of you that were at the ploughing match would have seen, literally hundreds, I'd say, of kind of technology-based things for sale to farmers. So this is a useful conceptual framework that we have around these digital technologies, the various steps, and you can see then where that particular person or service or product might fit in. Like the first step is obviously measuring, and whether you're measuring by sensors or taking the weights of animals or making an observation of an animals. And that whole area is being obviously hugely advanced by the Internet of Things, where we have sensors on loads and loads of things now out in our community. So that's the first thing. You've got to measure something, but there's no point measuring it if you don't capture it. It's like the farmer measuring his grass. Okay, he knows it there and then on the day, but if that's not captured somewhere into a database, it's lost as soon as he forgets about it. So capturing the data, getting that data from the sensor into a database is a critical step of utilising these digital technologies. And then obviously, once you have it in a database, you can start combining databases, and that's what we mean by big data. That's what I understand by big data, where we start combining, we'll say, your grass growth measurements with your soil fertility measurements, with your weather predictions for the next number of weeks, and so on. And now you're combining database and starting to generate maybe useful information. To do that sort of stuff, well, that's where the data analysts come in, trying to make sense of all the data and to turn it into information. And there's no shortage of data out there at all, but there's a huge dearth of information from that data. So I think the big challenge is down at the far end of this, which is the last bit, is obviously to deliver something useful back to a farmer or a food company or whatever, something that will help them make a decision, that their decision is being driven by information and data. That's what we want at the end of the day. So I don't think there's any shortage of activity back up the line at the measurement and the capturing end. There's loads of people involved in that. The hard end is actually making something useful out of that information, and that's where agricultural scientists have to come back into the frame, because we're the only ones that know what might be useful or know what information we want from all this data that might be getting captured. So the future impacts of that, well, the challenge is going to be, as I said, just turning that data into useful information. The other big challenge in the agriculture area is the cost of deployment. Like, agriculture is a very low margin business. It's not, we'll say, like the pharmaceutical industry, where the margins are very big and people can afford to pay a lot for sensors in manufacturing plants. Agriculture is low margin, so things have to be very, very cheap if farmers are going to buy them. Obviously, challenges around data ownership. Here in Ireland, there's a lot of data in public ownership, which is brilliant to start with. But again, there's lots of companies collecting information now, machinery companies. I showed you earlier that robotic milker, Lely, they collect fantastic information on cows when they're being milked every day, every quarter, and so on. Loads of it. There's loads of great sensors on it. But you won't get that information for nothing off Lely, even though it's the farmer's information. But Lely would say, well, yeah, we can give you all the ones and zeros and you can figure out what to do with them, but it's our sensor, and we have intellectual property rights on that sensor, so that sensor and the analytics on that sensor are turning that into something useful. So actually we have a right to that. That would be their line, and fair enough. So ownership of data is going to be something that will increasingly become an issue, because I'm sure ICBF would love to be getting that data from robotic milkers into the National Cattle Breeding Database, so there's an issue to be discussed in there. So the next game changer in this is going to be trying to take, and I think this is where agricultural scientists come in, taking a whole system approach to make an advantage of all those ICT type technologies that are now available to us. And obviously what we want at the end of the day is that our decisions are informed by information, that they're not informed by what you did last week or what you did last year, or they're not informed by your gut instinct, or they're not informed by some blueprint. They're actually informed by real lifetime information. We'd obviously be hoping for greater control and precision of what we do. A big issue on farms is labour and labour availability, so better use of labour. And I think one of the really strong benefits from these technologies is going to be the information that we're going to have available for consumers or regulators. But you know, there's I suppose a hunger, pardon the pun, among consumers for information about their food and how it was produced. At least not for all consumers, but for the more affluent consumers. And we want to be selling food to affluent consumers. We don't want to be selling food to, you know, people that don't have enough money to pay for high quality food. We want to be selling food to the richest 50 million people in the world probably. And they are looking for information on their food. So the ability to have that information, I think, is going to be a great bonus for whatever country is most advanced in relation to that. I'm going to speed on through the next two. New technologies for food processing. And again, the game changer here is just ongoing developments in technologies. And there's a whole suite of technologies that I know very little about. I didn't know much about the last three areas either, but I know very little about this area. So that's why we'll speed through it. But food is really, you know, there's lots of things you want to do with food, but extracting various things out of them is one of them. Very often you want to treat food to get rid of spoilage organisms, microorganisms. The general way of doing that is some kind of a thermal process. So your pasteurization, you heat it up or you freeze it or whatever. So using non-thermal technologies for getting rid of microorganisms off food, biotransformation, biorefining, 3D printing and so on. There's a whole range of technologies that are applicable or that are used in our food industries that are just going to, I suppose, change the way our food is processed, and they will continue to develop over the coming decades. So what will it mean, or how will we see our food industry changing? As I said, you know, these are related back to maybe the last point I made about the food and the information people want on it. I think we'll see our food industry moving from a provider of food and beverages to a provider of nutrition and health. So, you know, your food will be coming along with, you know, a whole health package, or you'll be thinking my food is not just to solve my hunger needs, but this is part of my program to keep myself healthy. So I want to know more about my food. I want this particular type of food and so on. Minimally processed foods is a big trend in the food industry. People want their food to be as close to the state it came off the farm in as possible. Foods for nutrition and health, I mentioned. A huge area of interest for the food industry is tailorizing nutrition for various life stages of people. So the particularly critical ones are the infant, the expectant mother, the elderly. So all those people have very particular nutritional needs, and that's both a challenge for the food industry but also a huge opportunity for them to produce foods that meet those needs. And then the cohort of people that are involved in various extreme activities, generally sports activities, but also maybe some extreme activities around your cognitive function or whatever. I'm not sure what that would be. Do you want to be able to do a huge crossword or something in record time, or I don't know. But anyway, you know, you can improve your cognitive function through your diet, basically. That's the theory. So that's a huge area. And the whole science around sensometrics, or, you know, how you sense food, how you taste, what it feels like when you chew it and so on is a huge area of interest in the food industry. Food quality and safety, again, going back to the next generation sequencing, but now that has given people working in the whole area of food safety a tremendous ability to know what microorganisms are in our food processing plants and where they are and how they're developed and so on. So moving on to the last area, which is a kind of a different one. At least it's not a straightforward technology, but it's transformation in the whole food value chain system. And this was one that maybe we struggled a bit to describe, but what we mean by that is that something comes along to change your industry. So it's a change in the scale of it, or a change in the specialization or something. And so examples of transformations in other industries would be, well, there are a number of them. If you look at Airbnb, it has very much changed the way the hotel industry or the whole hospitality industry works worldwide. Halo or Uber changed the way that the taxi business has operated. So they're obviously related back to a technology, an ICT technology, but the industry has changed as a result. An older one, but I think equally good one, is in terms of manufacturing, if you looked at manufacturing 100 years ago, and a huge innovation came in around that time when Henry Ford introduced the assembly line. And he did nothing different, like there was no new bit invented, but he put a new way of said, right, rather than sort of, everyone piling in on this car, and, the guy coming with the engine and he's stepping back, and the guy coming with the doors and he's stepping back, and the guy coming with the wheels and he's stepping back. We put this on an assembly line, so the car will come to the workers and they'll shove their bits on. And he revolutionised manufacturing by that, what seems fairly simple and logical thing. So that's what we mean by transformation, I suppose, in the food value chain system. And already these are impossible to predict. They come and you don't realise them. Like email was one, mobile phones were another. So you can't predict those. They're very hard to predict. But we have seen some, I suppose, transformations in our value chain, in our food system in the last number of years. Obviously, milk quota removal is a transformation. It really is changing the face of Irish agriculture. We're seeing it's slow, or it's not slow, but it's maybe creeping up unawares on us. But if you went back to pre-quota 4 or 5 years ago, we had more beef cows in this country than dairy cows. Now we have about 20% more dairy cows than beef cows. So we're seeing, and that trend is going to continue. So it's changing agriculture. We're seeing dairy farming, competing for land that might have been in tillage up to now. So that's a change in our production system. Here in Ireland, one of the biggest issues we've faced for decades is around land availability. So there have been loads of attempts to try to improve land mobility so that farmers can get access to land and to allow farmers to grow, I guess. So there are alternative models like share farming. There's a fairly significant change was brought in by the government in the budget 2 years ago around land leasing that has had a pretty big impact on the amount of land that has now gone into long-term leases as opposed to 11-month con acre. So that's again an example of a change in our system. I think the application of technology at farm level can be another value change, and so on. So there are lots of changes in the value chain that we're interested in, the agri-food system, that can potentially come along and be disruptive of the way that we're used to doing things. Likewise, the circular bioeconomy. By circular bioeconomy, we mean that the waste from one industry becomes the starting point for another industry. And we'll see, we already have seen new value chains being generated by industries using waste to develop a new industry. The greatest example in agriculture is in dairy, and probably where whey, which was a waste product when I was going to college, and it was a byproduct of cheese manufacture, and it was fed to pigs or something like that, some way to get some bit of use out of it. Now whey is the source of most of the high value dairy ingredients that are used in the infant formula industry. So it has been turned from sort of a very low value animal feed type product into the premium product of milk, and cheese now is almost the byproduct of the whey industry, and so on. So we'll see lots of examples of that, and that goes back to some of the bioprocessing research that is being done that can allow us to utilise some of those different streams. So to conclude, I think why are these technologies important? They're important because they'll help us do the things we want to do anyway, and hopefully do them better and do them faster. So we'll hopefully get improved production efficiency, we'll be able to protect our natural capital, we'll be able to reduce wastage, and we'll be able to meet consumer demands, whatever those demands might be for their food. We'll hopefully be better able to tackle climate change, we'll be better able to show how we produce our food and show our compliance with our various obligations, and use that, as Bord Bia do very effectively in the Origin Green marketing campaign, to show how our food is produced. We will see a proliferation, I think, of these high value food ingredients. We'll hopefully have less disease risk from our food and from allergies and from food intolerances. And for me, certainly, delaying the aging process is an interesting one at this stage of my life. Antimicrobial resistance, again, by better targeting the use of antimicrobial products, we can help cope with that, or help combat that, and cope with the loss of control agents against our crop pests and our animal pests and diseases, and complete this circular bioeconomy. In others, we get better at using the waste streams out of our agriculture and food industry. So they're the type of applications, and they're exactly the same as the applications we would have said before Foresight. So, you know what I mean? These are not technologies that are going to allow us to do something new, but I think they'll allow us achieve these outcomes, hopefully, in a better way. So in terms of implementing, or what did we sort of, once we had this done, what did this mean for us? What did we have to do? Well, I think the really obvious thing, and it didn't take us probably till we came to the end of Foresight to realise it, was that the agricultural scientific community needs to build partnerships with the ICT community, and in particular, and the agriculture industry need to build partnerships with the ICT industry. So I think that's one of the things, and I think Ireland is very well placed in that regard, in that we have, we're very strong in agriculture. We might be small, but we're very, very technically advanced, and we have all the big ICT companies, all the big sensor manufacturing companies located here in Ireland. So we're pretty well positioned, I think, to actually make advances in this area. We see the need, once we have Foresight, to create what we call implementation platforms, which are basically industry participating platforms that would deal with some of the issues I mentioned, like data ownership and sharing of data and stuff like that. So, and often you need some stimulus to make things happen. So we will be creating implementation platforms around those technology areas. Another area that I think is important, and again where Ireland can do something maybe, is to establish what we call a national digital farming testbed, and that's a place where, in concept at least, digital technologies can be tested and tried and developed. And it's at its simplest, what that would mean is access to data sets for companies. That if they, for instance, if somebody wanted to develop a new gadget to measure grass, right, if they come to us or they come to you, they can piggyback on, go out into paddocks where we know the amount of grass there, so they can calibrate their instrument there, rather than having to go out and get somebody that can measure grass themselves. So that's at its simplest. I suppose some of you might be familiar with the Connect, the SFI Centre Connect, and that's running this project called Pervasive Nation, which is basically rolling out a network of low cost and high efficiency, I presume, base stations that will collect information from sensors. So the sensor can send the information wirelessly to these sensors, to these base stations, and then it gets uploaded into a database. So again, having that kind of facility available on some of our research farms or your research farm, I think is, that would be a huge advantage to companies trying to develop technologies or sensors in this area. I think the last thing that we have to do, and that we have to be really conscious of, and that in any work we do with tech companies or with scientists in the ICT areas, we continually stress to them that the services have to be affordable and have to be easily adopted, as well as being very robust. Obviously, some of them are tickled, I suppose, by the challenge of putting a sensor out into a field as opposed to putting it into a factory, which they might have been thinking about last week, and the issues that creates around the robustness that's needed in sensors. So anyway, that's probably the easy challenge, but making digital services that are cheap and easy to be deployed is a huge challenge. As I said, there's no shortage in coming up with a new gadget to measure something. To measure something that's useful to measure is the challenge, and to turn that into information is the really big challenge. So that's it, David. For those of you that want to read the report, that's the link to it. If you just log on, click on that link, you'll get to the 80-page report, which does have a lot of really interesting background material around these technologies. So thanks for your attention, and hope I didn't go on too long.